afternoon, y'all. The last text we are going to read together is Daytripper. I'm going to use this video to introduce that text, to explain some of its features, its backgrounds and influences, and then to offer some questions that you might consider as you read. This is a graphic novel that in 2011 won an Eisner Award, which is kind of like the Oscars for comics, and a Harvey Award, which is another prestigious award. It's generally very well reviewed. It was originally released in 10 issues, so you would buy kind of one book at a time, and then you'd have to wait a month between each chapter coming out, which must have been really confusing reading experience, considering at the end of the first issue, Braz dies, right? So you must have wondered what was going to happen next. But then in 2011, it was collected into what's called a trade paperback, which is what you have in front of you. Each of those chapters focuses on a different part of Braz's life, a different year in his life. And chapter 1, for example, is called 32 because he's 32 years old. The last chapter is called 76 because he's 76. Typically, Braz will die in each chapter. And sometimes that creates a kind of cliffhanger effect where you wonder what's going to happen the next chapter, particularly after you read the first chapter. When you open up then to chapter 2 and see him there, not dead, it can be a little jarring. But I think that the authors are doing something very intentional with that. It contains elements of what's called magical realism. And if you're familiar with any Latin American literature, you might recognize that term from such authors as Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Cien Años de Soledad or The 100 Years of Solitude. There's a great, rich literary tradition related to magical realism in South American fiction, that you should check out if you are at all interested in this book. The characteristics of magical realism, we'll walk through that. Wendy Ferris outlines them. If you click this link here, you can read all about what she has to say. I've taken these elements of magical realism from this website. But this is a school of literary thought that combines realism and the fantastic in such a way that the magical elements grow organically out of the reality portrayed. So we will see, for example, throughout this book, that the world that the characters inhabit, that Braz and Jorge and Ana, Miguel all inhabit, looks like ours. It is got a degree of what's called verisimilitude, or it looks like our world, but there are elements about it that are absolutely not of our world. For example, the Imanja character in chapter 2 is a real life kind of goddess that affects changes in the world. Braz's multiple deaths. All of these things are things that can't really happen in the real world, of course, but the novel allows them to happen for certain effects, and it's kind of disorienting at times, but it also, I think, is for a calculated effect. The text contains an irreducible element of magic, something we cannot explain according to the laws of the universe, and magical things really do happen. There is not necessarily what's called a phenomenological explanation, or there's not necessarily an explanation that derives from some sort of change or some explanation in the real world, although the novel does kind of hint towards some perhaps explanation of that, of Braz's kind of brain at the end of the novel. I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but there is perhaps a phenomenological explanation for Braz that you'll get to when you get to that last chapter. Other elements of magical realism are a descriptions that create a fictional world that resembles one we live in, but there's just a profusion of detail. There's so much detail that we can kind of get lost in. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about this novel is the artwork, I think, is incredible. And it's also really rich and lush. And I'll show you an example of that, a few examples of that through this video. But I think that the profusion of details, or the fact that there's so many details, so many things for your eye to look at, really kind of gives the setting a depth and a realism that then makes the magical elements stand in contrast to that, or give an accent to that realism. And without those details, without the depth and the clarity of the background and the setting, I don't think the magic would work nearly as well. The third point that Ferris makes is that the reader may hesitate at one point or another between two contradictory understandings of events and hence experience some unsettling doubts, right? Often hallucinations or miracles. And those are things that the novel embraces wholeheartedly, right? Braz is known as the little miracle. There's miracle reference at the end of the novel with the brain scan, right? When we see Braz's brain scan, there is one potential explanation of events that each chapter of the book is perhaps some sort of hallucination of Braz if he has tumors on his brain. But there are also many, many other explanations that these are either dreams, these are fantasies, these are elements of Braz's artistic craft, that he is a novelist and his rampant imagination could be responsible for all of the different deaths he experiences and all the different kind of things that happen at various points in his life. And I think those two things are often in tension in the novel, and that's purposeful. So, for example, if we look at this page, and I'll talk a little bit about how to read a graphic novel here too. These are what's called text bubbles or thought bubbles. They're not necessarily said by the person, they're interior monologue, or perhaps they're even a narrator. So we see Braz as an old man here, still smoking his cigarettes. All the places my dreams take me, no matter if I've never been there or never will be, help me understand where I come from and where I want to go. So that's what I mean. That's what he says, where I've never been there or never will be there. There's something where the novel doesn't quite want to pin down what happens to Braz or why he has all these deaths and different lives he seems to leave in the books. I think that the novel wants to leave that open so we can think about that and question it and to think through different possibilities. And I think that's one of the another hallmark of magical realism is that it doesn't want to be pinned down to one possible explanation. The fourth part of magical realism is that we see a kind of near merging of worlds. So life, death, real, imaginary, waking, dream, these kind of binaries or these kind of terms that are normally a bit different are smushed together in the novel. So particularly chapter 9, which is called Dream, starting at page 203. Braz even says this can't be real. He thinks he's dreaming. He wakes up, but he's still in a dream, and he wakes up to another dream. So the novel's kind of drawing attention to itself. It's like maybe certain aspects of it aren't real, maybe certain aspects of it are fantastic, and that is another kind of central element of magical realism. These fictions or stories of magical realism, this is the fifth part, question received ideas about time, space, and identity. And this narrative isn't told in chronological order. You'll notice chapter 1 is Braz is 32. A few chapters later, he's 7 or 8. Our concept of time as being linear is questioned in this book. Identity, as Braz is a stable identity, he changes over time. He seems to live different lives over time, and these are all standard kind of ways that magical realism goes about creating its effects. These kind of tenets of magical realism don't necessarily have to apply wholeheartedly to every magical realist text that you read, and they don't even have to apply totally to this particular text. Rather, I'm just telling you about them because there are things that Ba and Moon, as the authors, are doing very intentionally here to engage with a long and rich tradition of literature that most of us, if we grew up in the U.S. and are used to kind of Western literary forms, may not be used to this type of storytelling. But it's rich and interesting, and I encourage you to check it out in all of its forms by all of its tellers. A few things about the novel itself is that this is different from Nat Turner, obviously, in that it's got a lot more text, and people will talk to each other, which creates another potential set of difficulties in reading. But once you get used to it, shouldn't be too much of a problem. So when you see these kind of circular bubbles, these are called word bubbles. And you can see clothes, the baby's bag, my meds. Those are all things that are spoken by Anna, right? The word bubbles up here, yes, got it, sweetie, are spoken by Braz. And then Anna says the one over here, let's go then. So the way you should read this page is Anna says clothes, Braz says yes. The baby's bag, yes. My meds, got it all, sweetie. Let's go then. So one thing you might do, and this is something I encourage students to do with all sorts of literature, is if you're ever hung up on a passage, you don't know quite what it's trying to say, or you're confused about it in some ways, say it out loud and try to even act it out, right? So you can imagine Anna's here, she's about ready to have a child, and she's worried about all the things she's going to need as she goes to the hospital. So her voice probably sounds considerably different than Bras, and I think him saying, "Got it all, sweetie," that's him trying to kind of placate her, trying to make her feel better, like he's in charge, right? He's even got his arms kind of put around her in a way that she might feel safe and the kind of husbandly or just he's trying in this instance to be the good supportive husband, right? So the text will generally go left to right, just like in a traditional novel. But if you see these bubble, 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 try to read it, go back and forth to make sense of it. What's interesting to me is this is one panel, and the panel itself captures one moment in time, but all this dialogue can't happen in exactly one moment. So it's something interesting that comics does is it represents a snapshot, but also it's moving. Like time is moving within this. So you kind of actually have to imagine that not only is this dialogue going on and it's showing us this one moment, but they're also walking towards the door here. And you kind of got to use a process called closure to fill in the gaps and to turn it into your own kind of little movie in your head. There's also thought bubbles, as I was talking about earlier. These are the generally square or rectangular bubbles we'll see with speech or we'll see with language in it. We compare that to this one. This is a word bubble. This is a thought bubble. The thought bubbles are either narration. It's either coming from a narrator, maybe it's Bras, maybe it's somebody else, or it could be reflecting the interior thinking of one of the characters, right? So typically in the novel, these are rectangular. In this particular passage, they're blue. They're not always, but they're often blue throughout the novel, just so you distinguish one from the other. So some questions you might consider as you read this book. Well, first, you might think about why it embraces the tenets of magical realism or not. Like, what does it being magically real add to it? What does it allow the authors to do? What kind of questions does it allow them to ask? Other question you might ask is about family, right? The recurring image is Bendito's tree at 114 and 218, and there's other places it probably pops up too. So what is Bras' attitude towards family? Does it change? Does he learn things? Why is family so important in this novel? And maybe what's even the relationship between family and birth and death and loss and all the other things that are the big heavy themes of the novel. The second question is life and death. They're also central themes. Bras does not seem to literally die in most chapters, although maybe you argue that he does. If they are not literal deaths, then what do they represent? How do we explain these deaths? Why are they important? Are they representing some sort of death of some part of Bras? Are they representing the kind of metaphorical deaths that has to happen for us to grow, right? As we abandon old viewpoints, as we abandon old friends and groups and things like that, as we grow and change over time. Is that what the novel's trying to represent? You know, these are all questions you might ask about the deaths that happen in most chapters. This book is also really interested in objects and memory and emotion, and the way that objects can trigger a memory and can trigger emotion, and the way that I think we've all kind of experienced that when you see some object related to someone who you care about or some time in your life that you care about or miss, and it kind of brings those visceral reactions, those visceral emotions back to us. The novel, I think, wants us to see that happening. Bras' cigarettes, for example, that sends Anna into tears in one of his deaths, or Bras' heart attack in his father's studies. He's looking at the copy of his novel on his father's desk. So what role do objects play in the novel? How does emotion work? Is the novel kind of saying something not just about the objects in the novel, but the graphic novel as a physical, visual medium that can potentially provoke our emotions? Any of these things are questions you might consider as you read this novel and think about it as a possible novel to write about for the course. All right, y'all, hope this is useful. Have a real nice day.